Hello, and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. If you're new here, Sinobabble is a podcast where we talk about modern and historical China. And if you don't know about it already, there is a Sinobabble newsletter, which I highly recommend that you check out, where we discuss more news-based topics, usually to do with China's politics, economics, and culture. So you can check that out by going over to Substack and looking for Sinobabble over there. So this week's podcast actually links up very nicely with the last newsletter that I did. So the last newsletter, for those of you who haven't read it yet, is called Is China Imperialist? And it's all about how China essentially perpetrates the same crimes that they accuse the US of perpetrating throughout the world. So things like taking advantage of smaller countries or picking fights with weaker people, things like that. So you can go and read that if you're interested. But if not, you can listen to this podcast, which is going to be all about the Belt and Road Initiative and sort of the positive aspects and the negative aspects of the Belt and Road as it turns 10 years old. So we'll talk about what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is, first of all, how it's defined both by China, the West, and the opposition to the Belt and Road, as well as more neutral parties, some of the positive aspects of it, as well as the negative aspects, things that have been overstated, and also what the prospects for the Belt and Road are now that we're in the sort of post-pandemic, post-COVID phase of existence. So as I said, the Belt and Road's been around for 10 years now. If you haven't heard about it and you're interested in China, then I'm quite surprised, but you might be new to it. So let's just briefly go over what it is, or rather what it's supposed to be, and then we can get into whether or not it actually lives up to that definition. The Belt and Road Initiative was initially introduced by Xi Jinping in 2013 when he visited Kazakhstan. And at that time, it was supposed to be this great revival project whereby China would help smaller economies, emerging economies, to build up their own economies and also integrate better into the global system by helping them to finance and build infrastructure projects. The idea is derived from the ancient Silk Road, which you've probably heard of or seen images of in the past, which ran all the way from Beijing, so East China, into both North Africa and to sort of the eastern part of Europe and the Roman Empire. The Silk Road really started during the Han Dynasty. However, it really took off from China's perspective during the Tang Dynasty. That's when it was most important, and that's when China had the most foreign trade with other powers throughout the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is supposed to be sort of capitalizing on the idea of the Silk Road and kind of reintegrating China back and reintroducing it as the main major global power that it actually used to be in the past. So the belt element is the link from China through Europe across that ancient silk trading route line. And the road is the maritime Silk Road that is based upon the old sort of Marco Polo maritime trading routes. It's always very confusing to me that the road is maritime, but the belt is on land, but you just have to go with it. That's what China's like. So like I said, the idea is that China would help to finance and build large infrastructure projects. So things like railways, airports, seaports, highways, things like that. And they also help to build smaller projects as well. So things like hospitals and schools, universities, etc. And depending on what resources the country has, they might also be involved in extracting those resources. So for example, in Africa, things like precious metals are a lot more integral to the Belt and Road than, say, they would be in somewhere like Southeast Asia, where you don't really have things like aluminium or gold in as high quantities. So even though the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative came from the central government, the actual diktat itself is very decentralized. So it's usually carried out by either state-owned Chinese companies or privately owned Chinese companies. And what they'll do is they're supposed to go out and seek out cooperation with either governments or companies within these emerging countries and sort of see what opportunities are out there and go out there, take loans from Chinese banks and help them build whatever it is that they need building. So the way that a project usually works is that a Chinese company will provide the host country or the host party with a loan, and then they will use that loan to then hire the Chinese company to help them build the project, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like a circular motion. Very interestingly, around 70% of the financing doesn't actually go to the government of a country. It will go to either a business or in setting up a joint venture or through like a special purpose vehicle, which is a very complex financial term that I don't really understand. And I also think that that's quite important as well. But we will get into that. So currently the Belt and Road Initiative covers around 150 countries worldwide. And that includes most countries in Africa and a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. So again, these emerging economies. However, it does also include more developed countries as well, places like Italy, for example. Now we've got a good definition of the Belt and Road Initiative, we can talk a little bit more about how it is characterized, how it's seen, the PR around it, both positive and negative. So let's start with China's own perspective on the Belt and Road, as it is China's own project. I think, they should get first dibs on how it should be seen. So of course, from China's perspective, the Belt and Road is this amazing positive thing. So they say, for example, that the core content of the Belt and Road Initiative is to promote infrastructure construction and connectivity, align national policies and development strategies, deepen practical cooperation, promote coordinated and interconnected development, and achieve common prosperity. From China's perspective, the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of like this white knight project that can sort of swoop into these emerging economies, and it's not just providing them with money, it's providing them with the means to help themselves develop, right? And that's kind of China's own story, and it's reflective of their own come up, if you will. They were able to get these technologies and get a hold of the means to improve their own lot in life. And that's what they're trying to bestow onto these other countries. And they use the word common prosperity and interconnectivity. Those are two very important elements. So bringing these economies into the fold, if you will, into which fold is something that other countries have questioned. But from China's own perspective, they would say, just bringing them into the global economy, it's important that every single country gets a piece of the pie and gets to reap the benefits of the amazing things that the world is putting out. The project is also a means by which countries can pull themselves out of poverty, but also sort of a bad situation, if you will. So something else that China says about the Belt and Road Initiative is regional hotspots continue to be in turmoil, terrorism spreads and rages, and large-scale flows of refugees and immigrants have prominent impact on the world economy. Peace deficit, development deficit, and governance deficit are severe challenges facing all of mankind. Today, when countries are interdependent and global challenges are emerging one after another, it is difficult for a single country to be alone, nor can it solve the problems facing the world. Only by aligning with each other's policies and integrating economic factors and development resources on a global scale can we form a synergy and promote world peace, tranquility, and common development. It's quite interesting that China sees economic means as a way that countries can solve what are essentially socio-cultural, political problems, or at least that's how maybe a Westerner would characterize that. Like we might see a problem in a country of corruption or authoritarianism or religious extremism and say, well, you need to solve that by changing your government structure or putting on trade embargoes or like political embargoes, banning these people, not recognizing their governments, for example. Whereas what China would say is like, give them some money. Money can solve all problems, basically. And again, it's not just throwing money at the problem, but it is saying sort of like, if these people are allowed to develop, maybe then the other problems that you guys see will be solved, and they don't need democracy. Not everybody needs democracy to solve their problems. Some people just need schools and hospitals. Another phrase that they often use in terms of the Silk Road is this phrase win-win. And that's a very important way that China characterizes the Silk Road, in that both sides can mutually benefit from any project that takes place. So it's not just China coming in and forcing their own economy their own objectives, their own resource needs on, say, Ghana or something like that. It is the Ghanaian people who need something and have the means to profit by their own natural resources and exchange that for something that China can give them. Now, the extent to which that is necessarily true is definitely up for debate. Again, something else that we're going to get into. I think anyone looking at it from an outside view could very easily point out, well, hey, it's very easy for China to say that they are approaching countries, meeting them where they are. But if you're Vanuatu, can you really say that you're on the same level as China, or that you can negotiate with them on an equal playing field? So I think that's one of the issues that a lot of people have with it. Western countries, Western superpowers have taken advantage of smaller countries and continue to do so. So I think it's also coming at it with that sort of cynical, critical eye of, hey, it's not that straightforward, and it's a little bit disingenuous to suggest that you are treating them as equals, but we could all be wrong about that. Another characterization that I think we should look at is the World Bank's characterization. So for those of you who don't know what the World Bank is, it's essentially a membership organization, a little bit like the UN, but it grants loans and grants to low and lower middle income countries to help them develop. So China is a member of the World Bank. I think that's important when we're thinking of what's the World Bank's perspective on the Belt and Road issue. However, other countries that oppose the Belt and Road are also members of the World Bank. So it's not completely biased, it's not completely unbiased, it's supposed to be sort of more academic. And they've made all of these reports about the Belt and Road Initiative, and they've kind of summarized what they think it's good for and what potential issues might be. According to the World Bank, there are 70 countries along the Belt and Road path that have either completed or are currently undergoing Belt and Road projects that amount to around $575 billion US. So it's quite a large investment on China's part. Even though a lot of the countries on the Belt and Road are different, the one thing that they all have in common is a lack of infrastructure. So the World Bank says that many of these corridor economies, particularly low-income countries, are poorly integrated into regional and world markets. In Belt and Road corridor economies, trade is estimated to be 30% below potential, and foreign direct investment is 70% below potential. The World Bank study basically concludes that China has the potential to bridge this gap and sort of plug it. However, only if China approaches it from a transparent perspective. Again, something that we will get into shortly. Ways in which the Belt and Road corridor can help developing economies is, first of all, by lowering transit times. Transit times are expected to decline by up to 12%. By reducing transit time by a single day, you can increase trade by 5.2%. Trade could grow from between 2.8 and 9.7% for these corridor economies, and 1.7% and 6.2% for the world. So I think that's quite important to recognise as well, is that the Belt and Road Initiative has the potential not only to benefit China and the countries in which the projects are built, but also the global economy more generally. All of the economies would experience a decline in trade costs, and increased trade is expected to increase global real income by 0.7 to 2.9%. And obviously the largest gains would be seen in Belt and Road economies. So the World Bank has a generally positive long-term view. However, they sort of temper this by pointing out that there are very real-time problems with the Belt and Road project. So for example, many of the countries that are taking on Belt and Road projects already have high levels of debt, and they are required to borrow even more from the Chinese government or Chinese banks. Many of the governments also have high levels of corruption, and this causes other problems in that these corrupt governments obviously have no problem in hiding certain aspects of their dealings with China, bypassing labor laws or environmental laws in order to get projects completed, and even eroding sort of indigenous ways of life or traditional economic practices, traditional jobs, because they don't bring in any money and these governments want money. This kind of brings us on to the oppositional Western, more often than not, view of the Belt and Road project. I feel like it's kind of unfair to call it just the Western view, because there are, first of all, many Western countries that support the Belt and Road, but there are also many non-Western countries, sometimes China's own neighbours, that do not support the Belt and Road. One major opponent shockingly, has been the US. So the US has accused China, somewhat ironically, of trying to build a Sinocentric international trade system. And they've kind of tried to set up their own things. For example, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, or FOIP, as I like to call it. China has basically accused them of being salty and just trying to imitate them in reciprocation. I don't think that's a bad characterization, but I think it's kind of par for the course when we're talking about China-US relations. There's not really anything new there to explore. Another opponent has been India. Of course, we talked in the last episode about Tibet, all about the problems on the India-China border, as China is wanting to build rail links to Nepal, or is building rail links to Nepal. And also Pakistan is a very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. The issue of Sino-Indian relations is only going to worsen as a result of the Belt and Road. Some other of China's neighbours that have issues with the Belt and Road include South Korea and Japan. Japan has recently signed a deal with the EU. I think it's the Asian Connectivity. It's like worth £60 billion or something like that, to try and increase trade and interconnectivity with East Asian countries and generally like the Indo-Pacific in general to the Balkans and Africa. So kind of, again, imitating that road element of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's difficult to talk about Japanese opposition to China, and it's the same with South Korea, because even though they on paper oppose the Belt and Road, they are all members of something called the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a bunch of countries in East and Southeast Asia who've come to an agreement, and China is also a part of that. So even though on paper these countries oppose China's sort of like international economic development, they're also part of it, just not part of the Belt and Road. It's more complicated than it seems on paper. You can't just say outright, oh, Japan doesn't want any relations with China and South Korea doesn't want any relations with China and they're banning everything Chinese. Like, it's not that, and it's not that simple. It's multi-layered, and it's another one of those situations where globalism and capitalism sort of confuse everything and make everything a lot more complicated than it seems. But there we go. Another thing to which foreign powers object is the tendency for Belt and Road projects or Belt and Road partnerships between countries and China to take on a kind of political stance when China said that it wouldn't, and it was just about economics. So an example of this would be the Solomon Islands. This is something that I also wrote about in the last newsletter, whereby China had signed a security pact with the Solomon Islands in 2022. This is kind of seen as being in exchange for the Solomon Islands recognizing China instead of Taiwan as the real China in 2019. As part of this security pact, China is basically allowed to do some undefined military things in and around the Solomon Islands. Again, we're not too sure of the details, and this is where people have a problem with the level of transparency when it comes to China's deals with other countries. But the Solomon Islands is basically said to, Western countries, it's none of your business who we have deals with, and we don't need to be transparent with you. But the Solomon Islands are located quite literally in tricky waters, and so countries like Australia, other countries with interest in the Indo-Pacific, have issues with China being able to do who knows what there. It's just another complicated situation, and it shows how the Belt and Road Initiative, through economic ties, has the ability to sort of expand into political ties, because you can't really separate politics from economics, especially if you're a developing or emerging economy. Sometimes your resources are the only means for you to even have a voice on the global stage. And when it comes to the Solomon Islands, around 50% of their trade is with China. So for them to even be able to speak, so for them to even be heard on the international stage, they would require China's support in the first place. What have the positive aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative been, and how do they differ from the way in which Western countries would say that their bilateral trade agreements with developing nations would benefit those nations? If you look at just examples, like random dotted examples of the Belt and Road, you can see these like amazing achievements, from ports and airports, huge roads that go all the way across the country, and like bridges that connect people to the other side of the town, which would normally have taken them 8 hours to get to. Things like new hydroelectric plants, or even, new irrigation systems. Things that can really transform both the locality and just like the ability of people to work for their own means and actually like get by instead of just scraping a living, and actually better themselves and improve themselves and their environment. If you just look at the actual achievements, it's easy to see, on the surface, it's all shiny, it's all bright, it's all new, it's all wow. But we should take a look at some real examples to kind of see it in a more level-headed way, and to see not only the positive aspects of it, but also where some of the difficulties that other people have pointed out with the Belt and Road may lie. So a good example would be Tajikistan, of all places. I don't know anything about Tajikistan except for this example of how they are integrated into the Belt and Road initiative. So Tajikistan had an aim, or has an aim, to become a industrialized country as opposed to a more agrarian economy. A lot of the agriculture in Tajikistan is based around cotton. So they wanted to go from basically just being a cotton producer and exporter to being a manufacturer of cotton goods as well. They were not receiving a lot of direct investment from other countries because it wasn't seen as a good or potentially profitable investment. But in 2014, the China Agricultural Bank was able to step in, give them a loan, and help them cooperate with Chinese state-owned enterprises, introduce new technology as well as new types and varieties of cotton, and help Tajikistan on their way to becoming a more industrialized economy. Now, this not only improved output of cotton, but it also created new jobs for people as well. And like I said, to help to technologically advance society as well. However, people have pointed out certain problems with the deal. For example, Chinese state-owned enterprises have to lease land from landholders in order to set up these cotton projects, and the landowners can basically set any price that they want. It's kind of making existing elite land issues worse than they already are, and is creating tensions among the local elites and local people as well. And it's also making it more and more expensive for China to keep operating these investments. And so it's creating an issue over whether or not it will be able to continue into the future as well. Another practical example is China's oil for infrastructure, OFI, deal in Nigeria. So the idea behind this is that Nigeria is a very oil-rich country. However, a bit like how Tajikistan did not have the means to refine its own cotton, Nigeria doesn't have the means to refine its own oil. Even though Nigeria has had access to oil for like 100 years now, large companies like BP and Shell have been in Nigeria for a very long time, and they have enriched local elites, local upper middle class and upper class people. I know this because a lot of these people are my own family. But even though sort of highly educated Nigerians are able to benefit from oil exports and foreign companies coming in and taking oil, the local people certainly are not. And Nigeria is a very corrupt country. It's very bad. Like, the infrastructure is very, very bad. And so China coming in and sort of saying, hey, we're not just going to come and take your oil, we're actually going to help you build rails. So they've built 3 major rail links. We're going to help you build roads. We're going to help you build a university and a hospital as well, I believe. And they've even helped to build some IT infrastructure, also helped construct an airport. So it really is an exchange in this case, whereas other large Western oil companies have sort of come in and just taken and just moved on. China is actively reinvesting that money back into Nigeria. Of course, you have the problem that Nigeria's government is corrupt, and this means that a lot of the time it's difficult to know where the money is going, if all of the money is going to where it should be going or where they say it's going. There's not a lot of oversight, and in general, there's a lack of transparency with these deals, which is what people's main problem is. While it's difficult to characterize whether or not there's, say, like active corruption or active debt trapping taking place, the lack of transparency is just generally worrying from people observing from the outside. But a positive effect that some analysts have said that the Belt and Road is having on China, particularly Chinese state-owned enterprises, is that when they go out into these countries, they kind of absorb a lot of the local customs and practice and legal codes when it comes to labor. So things like labor laws, gender equality, things that they're not really accustomed to enacting in their own countries at home, but when they go out, they have to absorb these local cultural practices. So for example, in Kenya, China found themselves sort of embroiled in a huge labor dispute, and another situation where there was also an environmental dispute, people not happy with where the project was being built and the fact that they weren't being consulted about where it was being built. And it was very bad PR for the project, and China had to kind of reverse a lot of stuff, enact a lot of corporate social responsibility type projects, and change their image and actually actively try and work with locals instead of just forcing the project through. Since 2016, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has actually started to publish more publicly the results of the social and political risk assessments when they start projects. Chinese state-owned enterprises are actually being mandated to take training programs before they engage in outbound investment into other countries. So those are some positive things that are coming out of the Belt and Road, is that China is learning how to cooperate better, I suppose. However, we should talk about the more negative sides. So we've already spoken a little bit about labor disputes. In some cases, China is actually able to get away with sort of unlawful firing or like shady business deals. And there was a lot of hoo-ha about how China, by building IT infrastructure for authoritarian or corrupt governments, is sort of propping up data surveillance practices that might violate the privacy of ordinary people. So that's concerning more from the citizen privacy point of view. If we want an example of the problem of transparency, a good example would be Vietnam. So in Vietnam, they have a problem that they're terming disguised investment. So in general, by Vietnamese law, foreign individuals and companies are not actually allowed to own land or property in Vietnam, or it's very restricted. However, China has been able to get around this by allowing their state-owned companies to either set up joint ventures, or through like family and friends in Vietnam, they're able to buy up little bits of land, or they'll say that the company is owned by a Vietnamese person when it's actually not, and get around these local legal restrictions, also by cooperating with local officials and, law enforcement, because if you don't have their cooperation, they're going to see through the fact that you're hiring like your second cousin to pretend that he owns your company, right? And they're also using this to get around things like trade embargoes. So for example, when the US increased trade tariffs with China, they would set up a lot of their woodworking factories in Vietnam to say that the place of origin for the goods was Vietnam, send them back to China to be finished, and then send them on to the US without having the huge trade tariff, because technically the country of origin was Vietnam and not China. So they're also using it to get around global economic restrictions, which is quite clever, but obviously problematic from a transparency perspective. There's also another issue of environmental laws. There's loads and loads and loads of examples, loads of different countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, etc. But to pick one out of any number of them, we can talk about the Sino Hydro financed project in Ghana, which is worth $2 billion. So the Ghanaian government promised to use profits from the sale of aluminium, of which they have a lot, it's a natural resource in Ghana, to repay the loans given for the building of the hydroelectric plant. The existing infrastructure for the aluminium mines in Ghana weren't really up to scratch. So the government said that they were going to build 3 new mines, as well as 3 new refineries and 1 smelting plant, in order to get the aluminium production up to a point where it could repay China's loans. However, in order to do this, they basically didn't carry out any risk assessments or ecological assessments. There were lots of procedures that they were supposed to go through that they basically didn't in order to start producing more aluminium. And one of the places in which they wanted to build one of the mines is a place called the Atawa Forest Reserve, which is home to over 2,000 plant and animal species, and it's already being threatened by illegal gold mining. Again, Ghana is a very resource-rich area. And it also ignores the fact that many local communities are reliant on that sort of reserve area for their daily lives, things like firewood, raw materials, food even. And so it's another example of a government, an emerging economy or low middle income economy prioritizing development and sort of the rising of the tide to lift all ships over the preservation of local, smaller, less economically viable customs that are less important to the overall development of the country. Another big problem is debt. There's been a lot of talk and debate about how indebted countries become to China by going through the Belt and Road project. The problem is that everything is so shrouded in mystery, and it's very difficult to assess this even by the World Bank. However, what a World Bank report did find was that 42 low middle income countries now have levels of debt exposure to China in excess of 10% of GDP, and the average low middle income government is underreporting its actual and potential repayment obligations to China by an amount that is equivalent to 5.8% of its GDP. Collectively, these underreported debts are worth approximately $385 billion. However, the World Bank also admits that the extent to which the debt might have an impact on both these local economies and the world economy could be overstated. As one report from the World Bank points out, due to lack of sufficient information on debt financing related to Belt and Road investment projects, the paper uses information obtained from news sources and World Bank country teams to estimate the debt financing, which is identified as planned or under construction from 2016 to 2018. It assumes that the terms of debt financing equal the terms of Chinese loans reported by debtor countries to the World Bank through the reporting system, and most of the projects have not yet been completed. So it's worth waiting to see how they actually play out in the mid to long term before we can really assess whether it's been a net positive or net negative for individual nations and the global economy more generally. So that's kind of how the Belt and Road project has played out so far. So I guess the main question now is, where is it going to go in the future? How will it fare after China's lifting of lockdown restrictions and in this post-COVID world? Well, people are not hopeful, to say the least. There are a lot of people who cast doubt over the potential for the Belt and Road and for China's economy in general. So I wouldn't say it was that they were necessarily targeting just the Belt and Road. But as one paper puts it, after spending more than $1 trillion to build a network of infrastructure projects across emerging market countries designed to connect large portions of the global economy to Beijing, cracks are beginning to form. Funding is drying up, existing projects are falling apart, and receiving countries are drowning in debt. The Belt and Road project was possible in an era of cheap money, spurred by low interest rates and blockbuster Chinese economic growth, but the picture is gloomier now. The Chinese economy is struggling to regain its huge growth rates in the face of a global economic downturn and continued restrictions from the COVID-19 pandemic. Complicating matters is anger from several countries over the quality of their Belt and Road projects. The Wall Street Journal recently reported on several Belt and Road projects from Ecuador to Zambia that have experienced severe construction flaws. Ecuador's $2.7 billion Coca-Codo Sinclair hydroelectric project is a prime example. Thousands of cracks have emerged in the Chinese-built plant that could knock the entire thing offline. As it's one of the largest sources of power in Ecuador, fixing the plant could drive the country deeper into debt. Last year, the Chinese government quietly made some changes to the structure of the Belt and Road. Dubbed Belt and Road 2.0 in internal discussions, Chinese policymakers agreed to evaluate new projects more rigorously and allow for debt renegotiations, which was a red line previously. The changes will likely continue if the global economy enters a prolonged recession and projects fail. So this article and others like it are basically saying that China's Belt and Road Initiative is in trouble, not only because of the global recession caused by the pandemic, which a lot of countries, if not all countries, are suffering from, but also the fact that the initial projects that were built and have been finished are now developing problems which will require fixing, which will require more investment, which will require more loans, and then these countries will end up in a cycle of indebtedness to China. Again, as the World Bank report said, it's difficult to know to what extent that's the case. We have to wait for the long-term or even mid to long-term events to play out before we can find out just how indebted individual countries or individual firms are. But if a major private firm in a country is in trouble, as we saw with the 2008 global crash, the government will have to come and bail it out so that the entire economy doesn't collapse and falter and everyone doesn't lose their jobs. So it's difficult to say right now where the Belt and Road Initiative stands. I think, like all global projects and the global economy in general, it's in a shaky place. We're all in a shaky place right now. The whole economy of the whole world is just shaking. But it has potential, and it kind of has to have potential because so many places and so many people are reliant upon it and dependent upon China's continued investment, and sort of they've probably based their own economies and their own projections on whether or not China will continue to invest in them. So it's not a case that China can just pull the plug on a lot of these projects. It will have to see them through. And I think if we see like a domino effect, a chain of a lot of these projects failing and China continually pulling out, that's where we're going to start to see problems. But right now, there aren't any real major problems. I think certain people want there to be problems and want the Belt and Road to fail and want China to be a laughing stock and miserable, and also kind of leave these poorer countries in the dirt, which is kind of a shame. I don't think people are really thinking about the poorer or developing countries and like their prospects and their goals and dreams when they're saying things like they want the Belt and Road to fail or the Belt and Road is evil or whatever. Even if China does have its own nefarious goals, these countries also have their goals. They're also using China, again, not to the same extent that China is using them, but they're getting something out of it too. So I don't think we should be so quick to rush to hope for China's demise and to hope for the failure of this project. I think we should encourage China to be more transparent and to, perhaps make requests as Western countries do that, hey, if you want us to come in and invest, you have to fix this, this and that with your governments or with your politics or with your NGOs. But China doesn't do that, so why would they expect other countries to do that realistically? So that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on your favorite podcast player, please do leave a nice rating for me and a nice comment. I think it helps with the algorithm, but I'm not actually sure if that's true. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Sinobabble newsletter over on Substack, and you can also follow me on Twitter, and you can also buy me a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/SinobabblePod, where you can donate to support my efforts, either with a monthly contribution or a one-off contribution, whatever tickles your fancy, or you can continue to listen for free if you so wish. Thanks very much, and I will see you in the next episode.